Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for our Incorporating Vendor Issue Management into Your Third-Party Risk Management Process webinar. My name is Jessie Redmond, and I will be your host. On your screen, you should see multiple widgets that you can use, including Ask Question, Media Player, Slides, Related Content widget, Speaker Bio, Request Demo, and Help. If you're not familiar with our webinars, all the widget boxes are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to maximize your screen space. At the bottom of your screen in the toolbar are icon buttons you can use to show and hide those widgets. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right corner of the widget. If you experience any issues or have technical questions, you can use the Help widget or submit them along with any other questions through the Ask Question widget. Don't worry, we do capture all questions throughout each session. We will be answering some during the webcast, but those that we do not have a chance to answer live, we will address with you via email. Today's live session is eligible for 1 CPE credit. If you wish to receive this credit, please remember to answer all of the polling questions that will appear on your screen during today's presentation. You will also be sent a follow-up survey link 24 hours after the live session that will need to be completed in order to receive the CPE credit. With us today, we have Greg Cameron, VinMinder's Head of Third-Party Risk Advisory. He will discuss incorporating standardized issue management procedures into your vendor management process, how you can protect your organization's reputation, customers, and more. You also see a link to a copy of today's slide deck, a link to our website, a link to our samples library, links to our vendor issues and challenges, What Leverage Do You Have ebook, our How to Manage Issues with Vendors infographic, our 5 Pitfalls of Vendor Risk interactive game and quick guide, as well as a link to our library of additional resources, all within the Related Content widget. With all that being said, I'd like to hand it over to Greg. Greg, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Jessie. Welcome, everyone. So looking at the agenda for today, let's start with just looking at it, what an issue is in terms of definition. Your organization might have a different impression on it. Let's do some level setting there for the context of today. We'll look at where issues management lives in the third-party risk management lifecycle. We'll look at reasons why managing vendor issues are important and where you'll see them, how to manage them effectively, how to build up your process. And lastly, we'll tie it together with best practices to summarize what we're impressing upon you today and how to take this away with some actions and evaluate your own process in an effort to streamline and improve what you're currently doing. So what is an issue? Well, the Webster's definition is an important topic or problem for debate or discussion. From a third-party risk management perspective, we should think about an issue as an unexpected result or a scenario requiring further evaluation or actions to mitigate risk. And that's what we're talking about here today. It might be an unexpected result through due diligence or contracting or monitoring. And what do you have to do about that unexpected result? Well, we have issues management. It's the process of identifying, managing, tracking, remediating, making sure it's collaborative and the right players are on the field for this game, and making sure it's centralized so everyone has visibility to the status, the potential impact, and what's being done about it. So that's what we're here for today, is to talk about issues, how to manage them, and why it's so important across the entire life cycle. Well, here's the third-party risk management life cycle. Many of you have seen this before. We released this earlier in 2022. And we're talking about issues management across the entire life cycle here. All of these stages, all of these processes within onboarding vendors and the ongoing management, assessment, monitoring of them, and the offboarding, the termination and exiting, Issues can be identified anywhere in this third-party life cycle. It's important to develop a process that allows you to identify and apply the best practices that you're hearing today anywhere across this life cycle. So why issue management is important? We documented 6 reasons here, and failing to address vendor issues at a high level is going to cause your organization problems. So specifically on the reputation side, your customers are going to expect you to have the best practices in place. And issues management is part of third-party risk management best practices. But beyond that, your customers might directly be interfacing with your vendors. So again, it will protect your reputation by managing those vendors directly and keeping them honest and formally accountable to service level agreements and monitoring risk and making sure that you're using the best vendors that are interfacing with your customers. Similarly, vendors might be supporting your own operations directly. So especially as we look at your critical functions that are partly or wholly supported by vendors, there's a huge risk there. And obviously you want to maintain strong best practices, and issues management is a piece of that. And finally, meeting regulatory expectations. Regulators require you to have these mechanisms in place to identify, manage, and remediate issues. Who's doing what? What is the vendor accountable for? What are you accountable for? So definitely take a look at, talk a little bit more about this in forthcoming slides, but look at what expectations are, and are you compliant? And next up, we can talk about contractual obligations, service level agreements, key performance indicators. Your issues management process is the formal mechanism for documenting when you're not getting what you paid for, if there's any sort of breach of contract. There's also issues for disruptions, which leads us to the next. All of these formal issues are evidence and allow you to be in a better position when contract renewals come up. Of poor performance against contractual obligations, or referencing how their disruption or a cyber event has impacted you or your clients, puts you in a great position, not to mention potentially the right ammunition to consider moving to an alternate vendor altogether. And lastly, it ensures that your vendor has proper controls in place. Not just the initial pass of due diligence, but the ongoing routine revisit of that. Anything that's missing from a control perspective should be documented as an issue. Why don't they have a business continuity plan being tested every single year? We saw that 2 years ago. Why don't we see that this year? Well, you can note that as an issue. Across all the different categories or domains that you have triggered for your due diligence for this particular vendor, if they're not passing muster, then that's an issue. So you can escalate that internally, send that to your vendor, and use that as the conversation to revalidate and open up dialogue about what those controls are, what your concerns are.
And this brings us to the first poll question of the day. You should see the poll question now in the slides area. If you have any issues, please feel free to send us a message using the Ask Question widget, and we will be happy to assist. As a reminder, if you wish to receive the CPE credit for today's session, you must answer all poll questions and be in attendance for the entire live session. This poll question is, does your organization currently have a vendor issue management process in place as part of your third-party risk management process? Yes, no, somewhat, or not sure. And Greg, it looks like we have some time right now to answer one of the questions that has come in so far from the audience. And that question is, when and where can we expect most issues to present themselves?
Okay. Well, it's important to remember issues can present themselves throughout the entire third-party risk management life cycle. But based on experience, most, in terms of volume, could be seen in new vendor due diligence in the form of lack of response or missing evidence or even observed poor controls in some form. And if you think about it, this makes sense because not all vendors are winners that you're going to want to go into business with, and you may be reviewing vendors that don't make that cut. Also, if you're seeing the highest volume of issues during monitoring, in the form of poor performance or degraded controls, that's very problematic and concerning, and you should be considering alternate vendors or other exit considerations at that point. Jesse?
Thanks, Greg, and thanks everyone for answering that poll question. Here are those results. By the way, you may have noticed reactions such as a thumbs up or heart coming across the screen. If you find this feature distracting, you can turn it off by clicking the 4 arrows in the top right-hand corner of the Slides widget, which will expand the slides to full screen and no longer show the reactions. Also, before we move on, in the Related Content widget, you'll find our Vendor Issues and Challenges, What Leverage Do You Have ebook. This ebook provides helpful information on the leverage your organization has when vendor issues and challenges arise. Greg, let's continue with the presentation.
So we covered why issues management is important, but let's just dive a little bit deeper here into some specific examples where you might discover vendor issues. And again, to reiterate, due diligence. You might be reviewing a vendor's business continuity or disaster recovery plan or pandemic in particular if they have staff and human resources that support the product or service, maybe cyber. So concerns, lack of controls, maybe lack of evidence, these are major concerns, especially if the vendor is critical to your own operations. So they can certainly be documented as an issue. And then beyond that, monitoring. Not monitoring for risk necessarily, but monitoring for performance. Are you getting what you paid for? We talked about service level agreements is a great reason. Well, look at performance over a period of time. Is it degrading over several cycles? Issues management is potentially the log where you can see it getting worse and trending in the wrong direction. And certainly that's evidence that you can put in front of your vendor at any point, and certainly during time of renewals. And monitoring for risk, there might be a deterioration in their financial condition, maybe there's some negative news coming out, and actual events. Your vendor has maybe had a security breach, data loss, some sort of a penetration that's been confirmed. These can be logged as issues. And finally, termination. Don't think of because you decided to use an alternate vendor or you're at the end of the contract and so there's potentially no risks. Right up to the very end, there could be a potential risk, and that's why you want to document any issues there. Good example is maybe you haven't received formal certification of destruction. Some know it as a COD. Maybe they didn't return the laptops that they borrowed. Maybe they haven't returned badges that have physical access to your buildings. So these are all issues to document so that you can remediate them appropriately. Well, hopefully you've seen the value of having an issues management process in place, why it's important. And we've given some examples So let's talk a little bit more tactically now about developing a process, especially for the organizations that are asking themselves, man, where do we start? We just don't have a process in place. Well, inform those that can raise an issue right away. Let your vendor owners or engagement managers, the internal business customers that have a close relationship with the vendors, first and foremost, let them know that they can raise issues and your intention to include this as a best practice moving forward. In addition and beyond them, let your subject matter experts know. That might be your business continuity or IT cyber team, legal. Think about the outside stakeholders that are going to be supporting these issues or escalate it, having them escalated too. You might consider anyone that's performing due diligence reviews that they can then raise issues because they're observing a lack of controls. So beyond that, make sure that they're trained. That might be running them through some scenarios and some fictional issues to make sure that everyone's performing things consistently, that you have standard operating procedures set up for them to raise and create a new issue. And that also might include access to systems. What is your issue system? You might have one in place already. You should definitely take a look at all of the different solutions that you have in front of you and evaluate them and make sure that they're fit for this purpose. And consider who's going to escalate, report, manage. Part of that's from a system perspective in terms of granting access. Part of that is third-party risk management governance. Who's going to make sure that these issues are documented consistently and the folks that you've trained are actually performing the right steps and documenting issues as they should be. And last, for developing a process, think about reflecting your issues management efforts in policy and program materials. Defining an issue, which life cycle stages might those issues be reflected in your policy? You might have roles or responsibilities as well in the policy that have to be updated. We mentioned some roles here. If they're defining your policy, add that as an additional item that they're going to be held accountable to so you can govern that and have oversight of that. So with a process in place, identifying the issue is the initial step before there's any documentation, is observing, recognizing an issue. Your vendor owners and your subject matter experts that are performing due diligence in particular should be able to consistently recognize the issue. You should define these scenarios. It's going to vary for every organization, but what you might do is consider standardizing a certain set and making sure that it's documented for visibility. Maybe it's in the policy, maybe it's in your program or your standard files. Give them some examples and say, this is what we're going to be looking for on a regular basis. And here are some additional examples to add to the list that we had earlier. So security issues on the vendor side. It might be through due diligence or other observations, maybe negative news, but certainly if there's a security issue, that can be documented. Poor vendor communication, another great example. So yes, they might be living up to contractual obligations for service level. Yes, they might have the controls in place and you're seeing strong business continuity and everything else you'd like to see through due diligence. But when you jump on the phone, you're not getting any response. And maybe there's a customer impact there. So vendor communication is another example of an issue. Resistance to providing required due diligence, certainly. That might be answering questionnaires. That might be providing actual policies, procedures, plans. and that documented evidence. Not meeting SLAs is huge. Certainly for your criticals and high risks, that's, it's just so important to be monitoring that regularly and having a mechanism to identify this issue as soon as it's not being met. Your contractual obligations there are so important. Not providing the required reporting, maybe failing to disclose material issues back to you as a customer. These are great scenarios to have documented. The purpose is to ensure that any and all issues that you're concerned about will be regularly captured. Well, the next step we should talk about in our overall process is determining severity of the issue. It's important to do this right away because based on severity, regardless of the specifics of the issue itself, there might be certain things triggered, certain things like other stakeholders that might be involved, or other steps like testing or implementing exit strategies. So severity is one of the most important labels that you could have for an issue, and it should be considered upfront based on the issue and also based on when the issue is occurring. And we'll talk about more fields to document in a moment. But severity metrics don't have to be overly complicated. It could be three or four levels here. I've personally used severe, high, moderate, and low. And you might have severe issues where there's a potential for an immediate impact to your operation or critical functions. Might be a high issue if an existing vendor could be disrupted, or there's clear signs of degradation of performance. Moderate and low could be assigned to both new or existing vendors. You wouldn't have a severe issue with a new vendor because there's no operational impact. You're not using the vendor yet. So it's important to draw a line in the sand there for severity and also consider what additional parallel activities can be involved just based off severity. Every organization considers severity different. You should think about what your levels are, how you're going to prioritize them, and ensure that there's the right amount of accountability and attention given based on severity. So it's resource allocation, it's prioritization, and severity helps you understand how to manage these issues appropriately. Well, the next step in the process of vendor issues management is the actual management of the issue. And this is documenting it in your system of record, formally logging the issue. It's important, first and foremost, to understand that this is collaborative. One person cannot oversee and manage any particular issue. Certainly based on severity that you've already considered, it should be understood who else is going to be involved. And these specific data points allow this to be facilitated more consistently with as much transparency as possible. So think about these data points like vendor name, but they're product and service. There might be more than one product provided by any particular vendor. What is the product in question that there's an issue tied to? What is the root cause of the issue? Maybe an overview of what has been observed, or the unexpected result, going back to the definition. We talked about severity. Date of the issue. You have to start the clock ticking, especially if you're assigning a 15-day or a 30 or 60-day remediation due date. The date of the issue is so important here. There should be an expectation of next steps. What is the follow-up? Who has the actions? Is it on your side? Is it on the vendor side? And who is it assigned to? Roles and responsibilities here. Who is responsible, accountable, informed? The vendor owner can't do everything themselves. Management might escalate to legal while the vendor owner is talking to the vendor. So look at that and assign it and make sure it's clear in your system of record as you're logging this and managing the issue. Refer to your issue escalation process. Again, there should be an expectation if, for example, legal is engaged. They might not be on day one. Well, at which point will they be engaged? And what happens if there's an unanticipated, challenge in managing the issue? At what point will they be brought in? So have an understanding of that issue escalation process. And another really interesting metric or field data point that you might consider is the third-party risk management lifecycle stage. For example, is it a due diligence issue for a new vendor? Or is it a recurring due diligence issue for an existing vendor? These are very different. It might be a termination issue or a contract issue or a risk assessment issue. Really important as you look at your historical issues and get a sense of where they're sitting and process improvement. Maybe it's through the recognition of multiple contract issues that allows you to see, you know what, it's mostly on us. We're taking too much time to facilitate contract execution, and that's bringing some issues to our internal businesses that have requested these services, and it's the issues that bring that to the forefront and allow you to evaluate your process. So I think the life cycle stage is also a really interesting data point to include as you're logging and managing these issues. Well, the last step here in our process of vendor issues management is tracking the issue through remediation. Obviously, that's the goal, is to close out and to get the final conclusion of these issues that have been logged and managed. Some considerations here through remediation are conducting regular discussions with your vendor. Keep them accountable, get a sense of status, and make sure you're always clear on what's being done and certainly against what you're expecting from them. Also have internal conversations. Make sure third-party risk management governance is briefed by the vendor owners. Make sure that legal is briefing your vendor owners to the conversation that they might be having. Maybe it's your cyber team that has additional input here. Have your internal conversations to make sure everyone's informed, and that's definitely the best practice through remediation. Certainly consider escalations along the way once your issue has been logged. It might not require that right away, but consider that as you're working towards remediation if and when needed. Think about an action plan or expected outcome with dates. Who's doing what? When are you expecting it? And certainly tie this back to severity. You might even consider parallel activities like testing an exit plan. You might be getting close to the end of an issue that you're expecting to close, but there's some complications and you're starting to get nervous. Well, if it's a severe, maybe a high-rated issue, maybe at that point you consider testing your exit plan out of caution. So that you're ready to implement it if and when needed. Certainly if it hasn't been tested over the past 12 months, that's a great opportunity for you to trigger that parallel activity while the issue is being managed and hopefully remediated.
Our second poll question of the day is, does your organization currently create issues if contractual obligations, including SLAs, aren't being met? Yes, no, somewhat or you're not sure. And Greg, I have another question here that I think we could go ahead and answer. And that question is, we don't have issue management in place currently. Where do we start?
Yeah, I would think about both people and process. On the people side, think who needs to be aware of your intent to capture issues and what training or guidelines may they need. And on the process side, what tools do you currently have or can you acquire to capture issues and track them and report against? But get a foundation in place. You can improve the process over time. In fact, one thing you might consider is piloting fictional issues. You might, for example, make sure you know what to do for performance issues or vendor disruptions. And that's with existing vendors versus initial and contracting issues with new vendors. Back to you, Jesse.
Thanks so much, Greg. We have about 30 seconds left on this open poll question, so please get those answers in as soon as possible. Thank you. Okay, everyone, here are those results. Thanks again for taking the time to answer the poll. Before continuing, I would like to direct your attention to our How to Manage Issues with Vendors infographic that is available for download in the Related Content widget. This infographic goes into detail about how to manage vendor issues, as we just discussed, the process of issue management. You might find this resource helpful. Greg, I will pass it back to you.
So here are some practical recommendations as it relates to this remediation or the goal of closing these issues that have been logged. You could keep a conversation log, and your system of record might allow you to do that, or it might be outside of the system of record in a folder. But having it centralized, we're talking about meeting minutes and emails that have been going back and forth internally or between you and the vendor. A centralized place for these conversations and documents is really strong idea to do things consistently and to ensure that there's transparency. So log all the communication and then update the issue as needed. There might be an area where there's a summary of status or of meeting results. That's where you can keep the conversation at a high level, summarized in the issue system, and a folder with all of the extended emails and conversation notes beyond that. Determine an action plan is a really strong thing to consider here. There's going to be more than one stakeholder internally involved. So it might be for implementing new controls or increased monitoring for due diligence or contract amendments. So think about who's doing what's their responsibility, and when are they due to deliver their actions. So real project plan here around the particular issue. Again, your issues management system or tool might allow you to do that, or that might be something that sits outside of it. But it's a strong best practice to have an actionable plan so everyone's on the same page on how to work to remediate any particular issue. Next up is additional escalation and or termination. There might be a natural escalation for an issue that can be resolved and remediated, but what about those issues that you can't resolve, where you can't come to a mutual agreement? What happens there? And you should think about that in advance so you have that process and that mechanism in place. That might involve engaging your board, senior management, seeking a new vendor, and implementing that exit strategy, et cetera. So definitely consider the worst case when you're developing your process, and certainly for real issues before you get there. Ask yourself the question, do we think we're going to be able to resolve this? And if there's any chance that you may not, then think about what these steps are. And then reporting. Reporting is a great way to show not just issues that have been resolved or the progress of current issues to the board, but it's also a way to look at trends and look backwards. And we talked about that particular metric or field where you're labeling the third-party risk management phase. This is where that's important. You can look at, are there multiple performance issues with a particular vendor, or maybe performance across multiple vendors that are providing a similar service. Or maybe there's issues with contracting on a regular basis, and maybe you look at that further and recognize that there's some room for improvement on your own internal processes because contracting takes too long. So reports often give you that visibility to improve your processes, and definitely will help with remediation. So let's summarize strong vendor issues management. We talked about the identification and the management and the steps to consistently work to remediate and close them. This full process will increase your visibility to your overall risk profile. For example, issues related to performance. We know based on conversations that's where a lot of times where immature issues management processes start. They don't necessarily look across the entire life cycle. They're just focusing on performance. Great place to start, but definitely, as we mentioned earlier, expand it. Expand it to all of the life cycle. And by capturing issues across all of the life cycle, you have increased your visibility of your overall risk profile. There's also triggers for exit plan testing and or actual implementation from these issues. There's an opportunity to better negotiate pricing when those renewals come up, putting the evidence in front of your vendor of how their incidents or disruptions have impacted you, how their poor performance has been monitored, logged, and how you've noticed trends, and maybe why you're considering going with an alternate at this point. Gives you great leverage and negotiation ability. We talked about approved reporting to the board and committees, but outside of your own walls, this is also a great way to show the maturity to examiners and to outside audit. Think about showing them not just the status of risk assessment and the status of due diligence and who your critical vendors are, but at any given point, what are your issues that you're currently working on? What's your historical ability to manage and close those issues and reduce risk and potential impact to your customers? That shows real maturity to an examiner and an auditor. How about the ability to terminate the vendor relationship due to breach of contract? That is the evidence that you're showing. There's been an issue. We formally documented it. This is why we're looking to terminate with you, Mr. or Mrs. Vendor. Lessons learned, long-term insight. There's always improvement opportunities. Use your reporting and your metrics to get a sense of where there might be shortcomings on your own side, and certainly where there are vendors that you want to start to monitor more aggressively or have these exit or contracting conversations with.
Our next poll question is, Has your organization implemented a tool that supports issues creation, tracking, and reporting? Yes, no, we currently are being implemented, or not sure. Greg, let's go ahead and answer another question from the audience. And that question is, what is the advantage of having a system to log issues?
Good question. I think I want to use the word system in two different ways here. So first, you want a system in order to ensure your stakeholders follow procedures consistently and via an organized methodology, the definition of system. But second, on the technology side, a system can certainly benefit you with time savings on the input and the output, consistent execution, evidence and reporting if and when needed. Think regulators, auditors, even your vendors, and providing them the output. So plenty of advantages there of the system. Thanks, Jesse.
Thanks, Greg. And as a reminder, if you have any issues submitting your poll answers, please feel free to send us a message via the Ask Question widget, and we will be happy to assist. Also, if you would like to receive the CPE credit for today's session, please remember you must answer all of the poll questions that appear on your screen and also be in attendance for the entire live session. This poll will be closing out in just about 15 seconds. Thank you. And here are those results. Thank you, everyone, for answering this question, as it's always interesting to see what everyone says. I'd like to point you now to the related content widget, where we have the 5 pitfalls of vendor risk interactive game and quick guide available. If you're looking for a fun resource, you should check out this interactive game. The quick guide shows you how to ensure your program will protect your organization and customers from vendor risk. Let's continue with the presentation. Back to you, Greg.
So the next 2 slides we prepared are referencing some sample regulation. It's impossible to reference every single regulatory body. We chose the proposed interagency guidance because it spans across multiple bodies. We want to highlight that issues are referenced from a regulatory perspective, and also that they are referenced across more than one area of the third-party risk management lifecycle, more than one stage. That's really what we're trying to impress upon you here. If you are a regulated organization, obviously read and understand and review your own requirements regarding issues management. One thing that you might see is with respect to contract clauses. It's the right to audit and the ability from that to remediate. So within these contract clauses that allow you to perform due diligence on a regular basis, there's also the, well, so what? What happens if you find an issue? That's where their issues management comes in. You'll see that the contract often establishes not just your right to audit, but a mechanism for remediation when issues are identified, like the lack of controls or your vendor not participating in your due diligence despite your right to audit. So it's not just about your audit rights, it's also what happens if it's not going the way you had planned it. You might also see operational resilience and business continuity aspects. This is where, from a contract perspective, you're requiring your third party to follow best practices for availability and for avoiding cyber issues. And they might be in breach of contract if they're not, if they don't have the controls in place, if they're not testing them, and certainly if you've seen an attack or some sort of a downtime or interruption because of these lack of controls. So issues management is the process and the mechanism beyond contract clauses that allows you to follow up and have an action coming out of the contract stipulations. And next up, what you might see from your regulator is a reference to roles. Who's actually involved in the issues management? Here we see board of directors being made aware of things like performance and any other material issues. There's also a sense of management. Who's governing these issues? Who's escalating as vendor owners or your business stakeholders that have the close relationship to the vendors? Who's actually managing the system, the issues management process? And also in terms of the third-party risk management stage of monitoring, you'll see a lot of reference to issues here because through monitoring, you're looking at risk, you're also looking at performance and SLAs. So most regulatory supervisory statements or regulation will have reference to monitoring and what happens if there is a poor outcome of this monitoring, and that's where you'll see issues. So let's tie this together with some best practices. Develop a process that can be implemented consistently and has improvement mechanisms. That requires tools, systems, that requires training of your staff. And that certainly requires looking historically at past issues and evaluating them for improvement opportunities, whether that's how you're operating your issues management or how you're just managing third-party risk management in general. Always train your staff. Ensure they know what to look for. We had a slide earlier about identifying. Giving them samples and examples across all the different flavors that you're concerned about is very important, and also ensuring that they know what to do if and when they do observe these issues. You might update your policy and program based on this conversation from today, based on improvements that you're implementing into your issues management process. Make sure they're reflecting your current state, how you're operating issues management, and make sure that it's referenced certainly from the roles and responsibilities perspective, but also in those life cycle stages. Where does issues management have a home for your organization and your methodology? Include open issues as part of regular reporting. You might be telling the board who your criticals are every quarter, or the current state of ongoing risk assessment, due diligence. Reporting open issues is a great additional metric as part of regular internal reporting. We talked about lessons learned here to improve all of your processes, but looking at historical issues at the time of contract renewals gives you that additional leverage when you're having those conversations with your vendors, especially if you want to continue utilizing their product or service.
Great. Thanks so much, Greg. Before we dive into more questions and answers, I would like to thank everyone for attending. I would also like to thank Greg for his time in sharing some really important information. On your screen now, you will see our upcoming webinar. On November 29th, our third-party risk management regulatory expectations to know. And on December 6th, our tips and tricks for document collections, a key aspect of your vendor due diligence. We hope you will be able to join us for those sessions. A link to register for those is in your copy of today's presentation slides. Let's now go ahead and answer some more questions that have come in during this session. Okay, Greg, the next question is, How long should issues take to resolve? Can they also stay open?
Sure. Well, the total time may vary on the type of issue and severity, like we talked about. So plan to have varied expectations. For example, an issue with a new vendor may take longer than an issue with an existing vendor, for a number of reasons. Having a contract in place is one. And with respect to severe issues being a priority, you might be aiming to resolve them within your business's RTO, or what their demand is for this product or service. Whereas low severity, you might be able to aim for a greater span, like 30 or 60 days. So those are some thoughts on total time to resolve. In terms of staying open, I would recommend issues stay truly open. We have to think about this. They were logged for a reason, and you should have a clear goal in mind. What is the outcome? And an understanding of what should happen if this, the goal and objective can't be met. So I would work to resolve and close out issues and label them appropriately. Thanks, Jesse.
Thanks, Greg. Next question. Should we, the third-party risk management team, have our own issues process, or can we utilize our IT issues management?
Yeah, I've seen both work successfully. There are, like most things, there are pros and cons here. Examples here are using an IT tool may save costs because it's in place, and might save training time and system management because it's corporate-wide. But having dedicated third-party risk management process might provide tactical advantages, might be easier to implement and be more specific to what your goals are for issues management. So I think it's important to consider your own requirements on the input and the output side. Pilot existing systems to evaluate how close they come to what you're looking for. And then obviously evaluate new systems accordingly.
Perfect. Next question. As part of exam prep, should we consider including reference to vendor issues?
Yes. As we mentioned, I would definitely recommend that as long as you can evidence a full picture of your process. So namely, your policy references, making sure that you've outlined your intent and where you're capturing your issues. And then on the evidence side, maybe a sample of the issue system, the data points that you're capturing. Maybe it's a screenshot of your system or a printout of an existing issue showing what you're capturing. And then consider reports summarizing issues by severity or summarizing issues by life cycle stage. Consider both open and closed issues. I'm thinking, in this evidence package. So overall, absolutely, this shows an examiner maturity to your third-party risk management practices. So definitely, I would include reference. Thanks, Jesse.
Great, thanks, Greg. This next question. One of our vendors had a breach, but we were not affected. Is this an issue that we should log?
Yes, I would consider this as something to log, mainly to ensure that the vulnerability was taken care of by the vendor. So you weren't impacted this time, but perhaps you could be in the future if, one, their change management isn't swift enough to correct the issue, or two, if the fix that they've implemented is not thorough enough and didn't achieve their objective there, or maybe it's not tested as it should be. So although severity will vary here based on things like data implications, I would still reach out to the vendor for a post-mortem. What have they done? Try to understand how they've responded to the incident. I think that's definitely a best practice, especially as it relates to anything on the cyber side, breaches, penetrations, data-related events. I would say absolutely.
Great. Our next question. Severity seems subjective. How do we avoid inconsistencies with that label?
Sure. I would recommend you consider clear lines in the sand. And we talked a little bit about that. Develop your own matrix with considerations like, is it a new vendor or an existing vendor? Are they, is it a critical vendor or non-critical? Is it confirmed, immediate impact to your operations? Think critical vendors that are supporting critical functions with short RTO times. And that's different than potential impact, or where it's just a lack of a control. So there's a risk there, but it's not truly an impact towards disruption. It's just showing that the vendor doesn't have in place what they should have to make you feel warm and fuzzy. Talked life cycle stage earlier. That too absolutely might be a driver for severity. So I think, that's where you avoid inconsistencies, is you have a developed paradigm and a matrix to understand where these lines in the sand are. What are your considerations? And build it out over time. I talked about that earlier as well. You can mature this and grow this over time to have it be more comprehensive and clearer, and a clearer picture. But definitely draw these lines early on, and that should take out the subjectivity. Hopefully that's helpful, Jesse. Thanks.
Thanks, Greg. I think we have time for one more question. How are you defining severe, high, moderate, and low issues?
Sure. I'll recall the slide earlier. Based on experience, less is more here. It doesn't have to be more than 3 or 4 levels. So certainly severe is clear cut in terms of that label. I would have high or moderate and low after that. What that does, as we mentioned, is there should be a timestamp assigned to those. The severe issues have to be taken care of first and foremost in the priority list, but also have a shorter time frame. You're expecting them to be remediated much more quickly than moderate or lower severity issues. So I think that's the key benefit and objective of having those labels, is understanding time frame, understanding how they compare, if there's multiple issues in queue, how you're going to prioritize, and also getting the visibility and the support that you might need. Just like a crisis or an incident, you're getting the right boots on the ground to have triage conversations and apply the right resources. And I think that's what severity in this third-party risk management context allows you to do.
Thanks so much, Greg. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have left for questions today. Thank you, Greg, for taking the time to address some of those that came in. Any questions we did not have time to answer today, we will address offline. We would like to thank you all for attending and hope you found today's session valuable. A big thank you to Greg for his time and great content. You can ask even more questions inside of our third-party think tank, an online community that is dedicated to third-party risk professionals and free to join. Just because today's session has ended doesn't mean the conversations and questions must. Post your questions at thirdpartythinktank.com and see what your peers have to say. In the community, you'll find thousands of free educational resources related to third-party risk management topics, including vendor issue management. If you'd like to become a member of Third Party Think Tank, you can register on the site or shoot us an email and we'll get you registered and send you a link to set your password. We did record today's session, and that recording link will be provided to you in a follow-up email that you will receive tomorrow afternoon. Also in that follow-up email will be the survey link for you to request the CPE credit. On behalf of InMinder, it has been a pleasure. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.